Part 1. The diplomatic visit. The morning sun cast long shadows across the ancient stones of Windsor Castle. It was one of those perfect English summer days when the sky was clear and the air felt crisp. Inside the castle grounds, everything was in motion. Staff members rushed back and forth, checking every detail one more time. Security personnel spoke into their radios, coordinating positions. Gardeners gave the lawns one final trim, making sure every blade of grass looked perfect. This wasn't just another day at Windsor Castle. A special visitor was coming, and everyone knew it had to be flawless. The castle had seen many important guests over its 900 years of history. Kings, queens, presidents, and prime ministers had all walked these same paths. But each visit brought its own unique energy, its own set of challenges. The Queen's Guard stood in their designated positions, as they had done for generations. These weren't just soldiers in fancy uniforms. They were highly trained members of the British military, chosen for their discipline and dedication. Their bright red tunics and tall bearskin hats made them look like something from a storybook. But underneath those ceremonial outfits were real soldiers with real training. Each guard knew his role perfectly. Stand still, eyes forward, don't react to anything. It sounds simple, but it's incredibly difficult. Try standing completely still for just 5 minutes. No scratching, no shifting weight, no blinking more than necessary. Now imagine doing that for hours in any weather, while tourists try to make you laugh or move. That's what these guards do every single day. The American delegation was set to arrive at noon. Their motorcade would sweep through the castle gates with all the pomp and ceremony that such occasions demand. Flags had been positioned along the route. The military band had been rehearsing for weeks. Protocol officers had reviewed every step of the schedule multiple times. Nothing could be left to chance. Donald Trump, the former American president, was arriving for what was being called a working visit. The relationship between the United States and the United Kingdom has always been special. The two nations share language, history, and countless connections. When American leaders visit Britain, it's more than just diplomacy. It's a reaffirmation of a bond that has lasted through wars, economic challenges, and changing times. The British staff knew Trump was different from other visitors. He had a reputation for being unpredictable, for speaking his mind, for doing things his own way. Some people loved that about him. Others found it challenging. But regardless of personal opinions, he was a guest of the nation, and British hospitality is legendary for a reason. Television crews set up their cameras at strategic points around the castle. Journalists from around the world had gathered, each hoping to capture the perfect moment or the most interesting angle. This was news, and everyone wanted their piece of it. Photographers checked their lenses, adjusted their settings, and waited. Inside the castle, final preparations continued. The rooms where meetings would take place had been cleaned until they sparkled. Historical artifacts were positioned just so, ready to impress and inspire conversation. Tea services were prepared with precision. Even the flowers in the arrangements had been chosen carefully, each color and type selected for its meaning and appropriateness. The security presence was massive but discreet. You could feel it more than see it. Plainclothes officers mingled with the staff. Snipers took positions on rooftops. Dogs trained to detect explosives had already swept every area multiple times. When you're protecting world leaders, you can't be too careful. One mistake, one overlooked detail, could have catastrophic consequences. Local residents had gathered outside the castle gates, hoping for a glimpse of the proceedings. Some held small American flags. Others waved British Union Jacks. A few carried signs with various messages. This kind of visit always brought out a mix of supporters and protesters, all exercising their right to express their views. Police maintained a respectful distance, ensuring everyone could be heard while keeping the peace. As the clock approached noon, a hush fell over the scene. The motorcycle escorts appeared first, their blue lights flashing. Then came the armored vehicles, black and imposing. Finally, the main car carrying the former president rolled through the gates. The moment everyone had been preparing for had arrived. The vehicle moved slowly along the designated path, giving people time to see and be seen. Inside, Trump would be getting his first good look at Windsor Castle, this magnificent piece of living history. The castle isn't just a building. It's a symbol of continuity, of traditions maintained across centuries, of stability in an ever-changing world. The car came to a smooth stop at the designated point. Security personnel moved into position. Doors opened, and then he stepped out. Trump in his signature dark suit and red tie, looking around at the ancient castle walls with obvious interest. This was a man who appreciated grand buildings, who understood the power of impressive architecture. The welcoming party waited, smiles in place, hands ready for shaking. British officials stood alongside American diplomats, all of them aware that the world was watching. Every gesture, every word, every expression would be analyzed and discussed. That's the nature of modern diplomacy. Nothing happens in private anymore. Trump began moving along the prepared route, waving occasionally to the cameras. He seemed comfortable, confident in his element. This was a man used to attention, used to being the center of things. The photographers captured every step, their cameras creating a constant backdrop of clicking sounds. And then he approached the line of guards. These soldiers stood like statues, perfect in their stillness, magnificent in their traditional uniforms. They represented something older than nations, older than politics. They represented duty, honor, and service. They were living links to a past that stretched back through countless generations of British soldiers. The scene was set. All the pieces were in place, and what happened next would become one of those moments that people would talk about for years to come. Sometimes history turns on big events, wars and elections and natural disasters. But sometimes it turns on small moments, brief encounters that reveal something deeper about the world we live in. The castle walls had witnessed countless such moments over the centuries. Kings had been crowned within them. Treaties had been signed. Alliances had been forged. And now, on this particular summer day, those ancient stones were about to witness another moment that would capture the world's attention in ways that no one could have predicted. The stage was ready. The actors were in place, and the next part of this story was about to unfold in front of cameras, witnesses, and the weight of centuries of tradition. Part 2. The unexpected demand. Everything had been going smoothly. The arrival had been picture perfect. Handshakes were exchanged with practiced precision. Smiles were genuine, or at least looked that way. The British officials were doing what they do best, making their guest feel welcome while maintaining the dignity and protocol that centuries of experience had perfected. Trump walked along the designated path, taking in the spectacle. The castle grounds stretched out around him, each stone and structure telling stories of kings and queens, of battles won and lost, of empires that rose and fell. For a man who built towers with his name on them, there must have been something impressive about a building that had stood for nearly 1,000 years. The guards lined the path at precise intervals. Each one stood at attention, rifle positioned exactly as regulations demanded. Their bearskin caps added nearly a foot to their height, making them appear even more imposing. The red tunics blazed bright in the sunlight. These were the Queen's Guards, one of the most recognizable military units in the entire world. Tourists photograph them constantly. Children stare in wonder. People try all sorts of tricks to make them react, to get them to smile or frown or move. But the guards remain steadfast. It's part of their mystique, part of what makes them special. They're not just soldiers. They're symbols of something unchanging in a world that never stops changing. As Trump walked past the first few guards, he seemed to notice them more carefully. Perhaps something about their bearing, their complete stillness, caught his attention. He slowed his pace slightly. The officials walking with him adjusted their speed to match. Everything in these formal occasions is carefully choreographed, but there's always room for small variations. Then Trump stopped. Not at a designated point, not where the schedule said he should stop, but right in front of one particular guard. The soldier stood there, eyes fixed on some distant point, face expressionless under the shadow of his massive hat. He didn't acknowledge Trump's presence. He didn't look down. He simply continued doing what he was trained to do, being perfectly, absolutely still. The entourage behind Trump came to an awkward halt. You could almost hear the mental gears shifting as everyone tried to figure out what was happening. This wasn't in the program. Protocol officers exchanged quick glances. Security personnel became slightly more alert, hands moving almost imperceptibly closer to their equipment. Trump looked at the guard with what seemed like expectation. Then he did something that nobody had anticipated. He raised his hand in a gesture that was unmistakably a request, or perhaps more accurately, a demand for a salute. The movement was clear, deliberate, impossible to misunderstand. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The photographers, sensing something unusual, pressed their shutters faster. The clicking of cameras increased. People in the crowd craned their necks to see what was happening. Even the birds seemed to stop singing, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Trump stood there, hand still raised slightly, waiting for the guard to respond. His expression showed confidence, the certainty of someone who was used to getting what he wanted. After all, as president, he had been commander-in-chief of the most powerful military in the world. When he walked past American troops, they snapped salutes without hesitation. It was automatic, ingrained, part of the military culture. But this wasn't America. These weren't American soldiers, and the rules here were very, very different. The guard didn't move, not even a fraction of an inch. His eyes remained focused forward. His hands stayed exactly where they were supposed to be. His posture didn't change. To an outside observer, it might have looked like he simply hadn't noticed Trump standing there. But that wasn't it at all. The guard knew exactly what was happening. He was aware of every detail. He simply couldn't respond in the way Trump expected. Seconds passed. In normal time, a few seconds mean nothing. But in moments like these, when the world is watching and expectations are building, every second stretches out. 5 seconds can feel like 5 minutes. The tension in the air became almost physical, something you could reach out and touch. Trump's hand remained raised. Perhaps he thought the guard hadn't understood. Perhaps he believed that if he just waited long enough, the soldier would eventually comply. After all, who wouldn't salute a former president of the United States? Who wouldn't show that basic sign of military respect? The British officials began to look distinctly uncomfortable. This was turning into exactly the kind of situation they had hoped to avoid. International incidents don't usually start with wars or harsh words. They start with misunderstandings, with cultural differences, with moments when expectations collide with reality. Members of Trump's own team started whispering to each other. Should someone intervene? Should they explain? Should they try to move things along before this became more awkward? But nobody wanted to be the one to step forward. Nobody wanted to be the person who made things worse instead of better. The journalists were having a field day. This was the kind of moment they lived for. The unscripted reality that makes for compelling news. Whatever happened next would be analyzed and discussed for days, maybe weeks. Every angle would be examined. Every possible interpretation would be explored. In the crowd beyond the barriers, people were pointing and talking. Some were recording on their phones, capturing personal versions of this very public moment. In the age of social media, everyone is a journalist. Everyone can share their perspective with the world in seconds. Trump gestured again, more emphatically this time. It was clear now that this wasn't just a casual request. He genuinely expected the guard to salute him. The confidence in his posture suggested he couldn't imagine why the soldier would do otherwise. Respect was respect, wasn't it? Military courtesy was military courtesy, but still the guard stood motionless. His discipline was absolute. Whatever thoughts might be going through his head, whatever awareness he had of the awkwardness of the situation, none of it showed on his face or in his posture. This was training at its finest, dedication that went beyond mere duty. The standoff continued. Trump waiting, the guard standing firm, and everyone else caught in between, unsure how this would resolve. The British protocol officers began moving closer, recognizing that intervention was becoming necessary. This couldn't continue indefinitely. Something had to give. The air felt electric with anticipation. What would happen next? Would Trump back down? Would someone explain the situation? Would the guard eventually respond? The entire scene had taken on a life of its own, a moment that nobody had planned but that everyone would remember. And in that space between expectation and reality, between American confidence and British tradition, something important was about to be revealed about respect, about protocol, and about the invisible lines that even the most powerful people cannot cross. Part 3. The guard's unwavering stance. The guard stood like a statue carved from stone. If you've ever been to Windsor Castle on a normal day, you might have seen guards just like him, standing their posts while tourists gather around, trying everything imaginable to get a reaction. People make faces. They tell jokes. They wave their hands right in front of the guards' faces. Children sometimes even try to touch them. though they're quickly pulled back by parents or staff. But the guards never react. Never. It's part of their job, part of their training, and part of their pride. These aren't actors playing a role for tourists. They're real soldiers from elite regiments of the British Army. The uniforms might look ceremonial, but the men and women wearing them are trained combat soldiers who have earned the right to stand guard at royal residences. This particular guard had been standing at his post for quite some time already. The summer sun beat down on his thick woolen tunic and heavy bearskin cap. Most people would be sweating uncomfortably, desperate for shade and water. But the guards are trained to endure. They learn to stand still for hours at a time, to ignore discomfort, to push through physical challenges that would break most people. When Trump stopped in front of him and raised his hand expectantly, the guard's training kicked in automatically. His eyes remained fixed on the horizon, focused on that distant point that guards use to maintain their bearing. Not looking at anything specific, but not looking at nothing either. A focused gaze that sees everything while acknowledging nothing. His rifle remained in the exact position required by regulations. Every angle mattered. Every inch of placement was specified in the protocols he had memorized. The guard couldn't have told you how many times he'd practiced these positions during training. Hundreds, thousands. It becomes instinctive, like breathing. The bearskin cap sat firmly on his head, adding weight that after a while you learn to ignore. These caps aren't light. They're made from real bearskin. A tradition going back hundreds of years to when British soldiers wore them to make themselves look more imposing on the battlefield. Now they're ceremonial, but they still serve a purpose. They command respect. They represent continuity with the past. Under that cap, under that impassive expression, the guard's mind was working. He was aware of Trump standing there. He was aware of the request being made. He was aware of the growing tension, the cameras, the crowd, everything. Guards aren't mindless robots. They're highly aware of their surroundings. They have to be. Part of their job is security, and you can't provide security if you're not paying attention. But awareness doesn't mean action. The guard knew that responding to Trump's demand would be wrong. Not wrong in a vague maybe sort of way, but absolutely, clearly, definitely wrong. The regulations were crystal clear. Guards salute members of the royal family, period, not foreign dignitaries, not prime ministers, not even British military officers above their rank unless those officers are in the chain of command. The rules exist for good reasons. The guards serve the crown, not individuals. Their loyalty is to the institution of the monarchy, to the nation, to centuries of tradition. When they put on that uniform, they're not just representing themselves. They're representing every guard who came before them. Every soldier who stood those same posts through world wars, through coronations, through national tragedies and celebrations, breaking protocol, even for someone as important as a former American president, would dishonor all of that. It would suggest that rules can be bent for convenience, that tradition matters less than making someone feel good. And once you start bending rules, where does it stop? If he saluted Trump, would he need to salute every foreign leader who asked? Every important person who demanded acknowledgement? So the guard stood firm. His jaw didn't clench. His eyes didn't narrow. His breathing didn't change. To outside observers, he might as well have been unaware of Trump's presence. But inside, he was making a choice. Not an emotional choice, not a political choice, but a professional choice based on training, regulations, and duty. The physical demands of this stance were significant. Try standing completely still right now. Don't shift your weight. Don't adjust your position. Don't scratch an itch. Don't blink more than necessary. Just stand there. How long can you last? A minute? 2? The guards do this for hours in all kinds of weather. Rain doesn't matter. They stand in the rain. Heat doesn't matter. They stand in the heat. Cold doesn't matter. They stand in the cold. People can wave cameras in their faces and they don't flinch. Someone can yell at them and they don't respond. It's a level of discipline that most people simply can't imagine. This guard had been through all the training. He'd stood through storms that soaked him to the skin. He'd stood through heat that made sweat run down his back. He'd stood through cold that made his fingers go numb. This moment, uncomfortable as it might be socially, was nothing compared to the physical challenges he'd already overcome. His uniform felt heavy, as it always did. The thick wool absorbed heat. The leather accoutrements creaked slightly with any tiny movement. The rifle's weight became part of his body after a while. an extension of himself rather than an external object. Everything about the uniform was designed to make the guard look impressive, commanding, immovable, and that's exactly what he was being now. Immovable. Not through stubbornness, not through disrespect, but through commitment to duty. He wasn't trying to embarrass anyone. He wasn't making a political statement. He was simply doing his job the way he'd been trained to do it, the way it had been done for generations. The seconds continued to tick by. The awkwardness in the air grew thicker, but the guard's resolve didn't waver. This was a test, though probably not intentional. Every guard faces tests. Tourists who try to distract them, people who try to provoke reactions. This was just a different kind of test, higher profile but fundamentally the same. His heartbeat remained steady. His breathing stayed regular. Physically, nothing about his demeanor changed. He was a picture of discipline, a living example of what proper training and dedication can achieve. In a world where everything seems to be constantly changing, where traditions are questioned and norms are challenged, here stood someone who represented constancy. The guard didn't feel superior. He didn't feel smug about his stance. He felt exactly what he was supposed to feel, focused on his duty and committed to maintaining the standards of his regiment. Pride, yes, but not arrogance. Determination, certainly, but not rigidity. He was doing what any guard in his position would do. What should be done, what must be done, and through it all he remained perfectly, absolutely still. Part 4. The growing tension. When the guard didn't respond to the first gesture, Trump seemed momentarily surprised. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but people who watched the video later would see it. A slight pause, a momentary hesitation as if he was waiting for reality to catch up with expectation. But reality wasn't cooperating, so Trump tried again. This time there was no ambiguity about it. He gestured more clearly, more firmly, leaving absolutely no doubt about what he wanted. The movement was deliberate and commanding, the kind of gesture that in another context would have immediately produced results. But not here. Not now. The members of Trump's security detail, standing nearby in their dark suits and sunglasses, shifted their weight almost imperceptibly. These were professionals who had seen countless situations, who were trained to remain calm and composed regardless of circumstances. But even they could sense that something unusual was happening. Their body language changed just slightly, becoming more alert, more focused. You could see it in the way they positioned themselves. They weren't moving closer or backing away, but their stance became more attentive. Their eyes scanned the surroundings more carefully. They weren't expecting danger exactly, but they recognized a situation that was developing in unexpected ways, and unexpected situations require extra vigilance. The British officials standing nearby had a different kind of tension in their postures. This was their event, their responsibility. Everything had been planned down to the smallest detail. Guest lists, schedules, photo opportunities, everything had been coordinated and confirmed. And now something was happening that wasn't in any of the planning documents. Two of the officials exchanged a quick glance. It was the kind of look that speaks volumes without words. Oh, what do we do now? Look, how do we handle this? Look. Years of diplomatic experience had taught them to maintain pleasant expressions, regardless of what they were feeling inside. But their eyes betrayed their concern. One of them took a small step forward, then hesitated. Should he intervene? Was it his place? Would stepping in make things better or worse? Sometimes in diplomacy, the right move is to do nothing and let moments pass naturally. Other times, inaction can allow small problems to become big ones. The decision paralyzed him for a moment. The American diplomats in the group were having their own silent crisis. They understood both sides of this situation. They knew Trump's background, his expectations, his way of seeing the world. But they also knew they were guests in Britain, subject to British protocols and traditions. Being caught between those two realities was deeply uncomfortable. One diplomat leaned toward another and whispered something urgent. The second diplomat nodded slightly but didn't respond verbally. What could they say? What could they do? This was their president or former president, and you don't correct or contradict someone like that in public. But neither could they make the guard do something he clearly wasn't going to do. The photographers had gone into overdrive. Their cameras were clicking so rapidly that the sound became almost continuous, like the buzzing of mechanical insects. Every photographer knew they might be capturing something important, something that would be on front pages around the world. They adjusted angles, changed settings, moved positions to get the best shots. Some photographers zoomed in on Trump's face, trying to capture his expression. Others focused on the guard, hoping to detect any reaction, any tiny change in his stony composure. A few pulled back to get wide shots that showed the whole scene, the context. The crowd of officials and security personnel all frozen in this awkward moment. The television cameras were rolling too, broadcasting this scene live to millions of viewers around the world. News producers in control rooms probably started talking excitedly, realizing they were watching something unusual unfold in real time. This was the kind of moment that makes news, that gets replayed and discussed and analyzed. In the crowd beyond the barriers, the atmosphere had changed completely. People had come expecting to see a formal, somewhat boring diplomatic ceremony. Wave some flags, take some pictures, maybe catch a glimpse of important people walking past. Instead, they were witnessing something much more interesting. Conversations in the crowd grew louder. People pointed and talked excitedly. Some held up their phones, recording their own versions of events to share on social media later. Others simply watched with wide eyes, sensing they were seeing something significant even if they weren't quite sure what it meant. "Why won't he salute?" someone in the crowd asked. "He can't," another person answered. "It's against the rules." "What rules?" "That's the American president." Former president. "And it doesn't matter." "Guards only salute the Queen." These kinds of exchanges rippled through the crowd as people tried to make sense of what they were seeing. Some understood the protocols immediately. Others were confused, thinking the guard was being rude or disrespectful. Everyone had an opinion. Back in the center of the scene, the tension continued to build. Trump's hand was still raised, though by now it must have been getting uncomfortable. His expression had shifted from expectant to something harder to read. Not quite angry, not quite confused, but definitely not pleased. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. The guard remained absolutely motionless. If anything, his stillness had become even more pronounced, as if he was demonstrating through his posture exactly what discipline meant. There was no defiance in his stance, no attitude, no message being sent. Just pure, unwavering commitment to doing his job correctly. The British protocol officers were now definitely moving into action. Enough time had passed that intervention was necessary. This couldn't continue indefinitely. The whole visit schedule was being thrown off. Other events were waiting. People were getting uncomfortable. Something had to change. But even as they moved closer, preparing to step in and explain, the situation remained frozen in time. Every second felt stretched out, elastic. The whole world seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Would Trump lower his hand? Would the guard somehow respond? Would someone find a way to resolve this gracefully? The castle walls, which had stood through so many centuries, so many historical moments, seemed to watch impassively. If stones could speak, what would they say? They'd seen kings and queens, seen wars and peace, seen empires rise and fall. This moment was just one more scene in an endless historical drama. The blue sky overhead remained perfectly clear, indifferent to human complications. Birds flew past unconcerned. The ancient trees in the castle grounds rustled gently in the breeze. Nature continued its patterns while people struggled with questions of protocol and respect and tradition. In American living rooms and British pubs, in offices and homes around the world, people were starting to see this scene on their screens. The news cycle had picked it up. Social media was beginning to light up. Within minutes, millions of people would be watching, commenting, taking sides, arguing about who was right and who was wrong. But in that moment, in that specific place and time, it was just two men standing face to face, one expecting, one refusing, one representing American directness and confidence, one representing British tradition and discipline, neither willing to back down, neither able to find common ground, and everyone else caught in between, wondering how this would end. Part 5. The protocol officer's intervention. The protocol officer had been watching this unfold with growing concern. His name doesn't matter for this story. What matters is his role and his experience. He'd been doing this job for over 20 years, managing diplomatic visits, smoothing over awkward moments, helping foreign dignitaries understand British customs and traditions. He'd seen his share of unusual situations, but this one was particularly delicate. He was a man in his 50s, dressed impeccably in a dark suit that somehow managed to look both formal and approachable. His face had the kind lines of someone who smiles often, though at this moment his expression was carefully neutral. Years of diplomatic work had taught him how to approach sensitive situations without making them worse. Taking a deep breath, he moved forward with smooth, unhurried steps. Everything about his movement was designed to appear calm and natural, as if he was simply walking over to offer helpful information rather than intervening in an increasingly awkward standoff. The key to good diplomacy is making necessary interventions look casual and friendly. As he approached Trump, he positioned himself carefully. Not directly between Trump and the guard, which might seem confrontational. Not so far away that he'd have to raise his voice. Just close enough to speak quietly, to make this a private conversation despite the very public setting. His body language was open, his expression pleasant. "Mr. President," he said quietly, using the title that former presidents traditionally retain. His voice was respectful but not obsequious, friendly but not overly familiar. Getting the tone right in these moments is crucial. Too formal and you create distance. Too casual and you might cause offense. The protocol officer had found the balance through decades of practice. Trump turned toward him, clearly ready for some kind of explanation for why the guard wasn't responding. His expression suggested he expected the protocol officer to sort this out, to make the guard do what was expected. After all, that's what staff are for, right? To make things happen smoothly. The protocol officer smiled gently and continued in that same quiet, diplomatic tone. "I understand there may be some confusion, sir. Perhaps I might explain the protocols regarding the Queen's Guard." He phrased it as a question, as an offer, not as a correction. Never directly correct someone in a position of power, especially not in public. Offer information instead. Trump nodded, though his posture remained stiff. The protocol officer took that as permission to continue. Around them, the cameras kept rolling. Officials kept watching. But the officer focused entirely on this conversation. Everything else could wait. "The Queen's Guard operates under very specific regulations that have been in place for centuries," he explained, his voice maintaining that perfect diplomatic balance. Not lecturing, not condescending, just sharing information. These regulations are quite strict about when and to whom a guard may render a salute. He paused briefly, letting that sink in before continuing. "Guards are permitted to salute members of the British royal family, specifically those in the line of succession and certain senior royals. This is because they serve Her Majesty directly, and their primary duty is to the crown." Trump was listening now, though his expression suggested he wasn't entirely pleased with this explanation. The protocol officer had expected that. People often don't like being told that rules apply to them the same way they apply to everyone else. But rules are rules, and some rules can't be bent even for the most important visitors. Foreign dignitaries, regardless of their rank or position, the officer continued carefully, are not included in these protocols. This isn't a matter of disrespect, you understand. It's simply how the regulations have always functioned. The guards serve the monarchy specifically, and their salutes are reserved for that service. He gestured slightly toward the guard, who remained perfectly still throughout this conversation. This soldier isn't being rude or disobedient by not saluting. In fact, he's doing exactly what he should be doing. Following his orders, maintaining his post, adhering to centuries of military tradition. For him to salute anyone outside the approved list would actually constitute a breach of duty. The protocol officer watched Trump's face carefully, trying to gauge how this explanation was being received. Reading people is a critical skill in diplomacy. You need to know when to say more and when to stop talking, when to elaborate, and when to simply let silence do its work. "If you'd like," the officer added helpfully, "there are certainly photographs we can arrange with the guards in other contexts." The guards do participate in certain ceremonial occasions where different protocols apply, but here at their posts they maintain very specific standards of conduct. Around them, the other officials had visibly relaxed. The intervention was working. The protocol officer was handling it smoothly, providing explanation without embarrassment, offering alternatives without making demands. This was diplomatic skill at its finest, the ability to redirect a difficult situation without creating conflict. The American diplomats in the group looked relieved. They'd been worried about how to handle this, and now someone else had stepped up and done it for them. The British officials nodded slightly to themselves, appreciating their colleagues' expertise. This was why you had experienced protocol officers, why you didn't just assign anyone to these positions. The protocol officer continued in his calm, explanatory tone. The tradition of the Queen's Guard is quite fascinating, actually. These aren't ceremonial soldiers in the way some people think. They're serving members of the Household Division, active military personnel from regiments with distinguished combat histories, the Grenadier Guards, the Coldstream Guards, the Scots Guards, and others. He was doing something clever now, redirecting the conversation toward interesting historical information, rather than focusing on the awkward moment. Give people something else to think about, and they often forget to be upset about the original issue. These regiments have fought in nearly every major British conflict for the past few centuries. The men and women who guard the royal residences are selected for their discipline and dedication, standing completely still for hours at a time, maintaining composure regardless of distractions. That requires real training and commitment. Trump seemed to be processing this information. His hand had finally lowered from its expectant position. The tension in his shoulders eased slightly. The protocol officer recognized these signs. The moment was passing. The immediate crisis was being diffused. The regulations they follow, the officer continued, are taken very seriously. They're not suggestions or guidelines. They're absolute requirements. Breaking them, even for someone as distinguished as yourself, would actually dishonor the Guard rather than honor him. It would suggest that his duty can be compromised, and for these soldiers, duty cannot be compromised. It was a masterful explanation. The protocol officer had framed the Guard's refusal not as rejection but as honor, not as disrespect but as integrity. He'd taken what could have been seen as an insult and reframed it as a demonstration of the very military values that everyone could respect. The cameras had captured all of this, of course. Later, when people watched the videos, they'd see this moment. They'd see the protocol officer's smooth intervention, his careful explanation, his diplomatic skill. Some would praise the handling of the situation. Others would criticize it. But everyone would recognize that a potentially explosive moment had been skillfully managed. Trump nodded slowly, seeming to accept the explanation, even if he didn't particularly like it. The protocol officer recognized that nod. It was the nod of someone who understands they're not going to get what they wanted, but can't really argue with the reasoning. It was time to move things forward. "Shall we continue with the program?" the officer suggested gently, gesturing toward the rest of the route. "There's quite a bit more to see, and I believe some refreshments are waiting inside." Always give people a graceful exit, a way to move past awkward moments without dwelling on them. The group began to move again, slowly at first, then with more purpose. The spell was broken. The standoff was over. Heart 6, the Guard's quiet response. The protocol officer had finished his explanation and was beginning to guide the group away when something unexpected happened. The Guard, who had remained silent and motionless throughout the entire encounter, finally spoke. Not loudly, not aggressively, but with a clarity that carried across the courtyard despite the gentle volume of his voice. "I serve Her Majesty the Queen, sir." 5 words. That's all it took. 5 simple words delivered in a tone that was respectful but absolutely firm. There was no apology in his voice. No hesitation, no doubt. Just a clear statement of fact, delivered by a man who knew exactly where his loyalties lay and wasn't afraid to express them. The effect was immediate and profound. Everyone within earshot froze for a moment. The protocol officer, who had been mid-step, paused. Trump turned back slightly, processing what he'd just heard. The other officials exchanged glances. The photographers, who had started to lower their cameras, quickly raised them again. This was the moment. This was what everyone would remember. The Guard's voice had been perfectly pitched, not shouting, which would have seemed aggressive or disrespectful. Not mumbling, which would have seemed uncertain or cowardly. Just clear, measured, professional. The voice of a soldier stating his position, his duty, his unwavering commitment to service. What made the words so powerful was their simplicity. He didn't give a long explanation. He didn't cite regulations or protocols. He didn't justify or defend his actions. He simply stated the fundamental truth of his position. He served the Queen. Everything else followed from that. All the protocols, all the traditions, all the training, it all came down to that one basic fact. The Guard's eyes had never moved from their forward focus during his statement. He hadn't looked at Trump. He hadn't looked at the protocol officer or any of the other officials. His gaze remained fixed on that distant point, his posture unchanged, his discipline unbroken. He'd spoken without compromising his stance in any way. This was significant. Speaking at all was unusual for a guard on duty. They're trained to remain silent, to be living statues, but sometimes, rarely, when clarification is absolutely necessary, they are permitted to speak briefly and professionally. The guard had judged this to be one of those moments. A brief statement was needed to make the situation clear. In those 5 words, he'd communicated volumes. He wasn't saying no to Trump personally. He wasn't making a political statement. He wasn't being stubborn or difficult. He was simply reminding everyone, including Trump, that he had a duty that transcended individual requests or expectations. His loyalty was to an institution, to a tradition, to a monarch, not to any individual who happened to be walking past. The phrase, "I serve Her Majesty the Queen," carries enormous weight in British culture. It's not just words, it's a declaration of purpose. Members of the British military swear an oath to the Queen, not to the government or to any political party. Their loyalty is to the crown, to the continuity and stability that the monarchy represents. For generations, British soldiers have understood this distinction. They serve the nation through service to the crown. This isn't just ceremonial language. It's a fundamental principle that shapes how the military operates, how it sees its role, how it maintains its independence from political pressures. The guard's statement was a reminder of this principle. He wasn't being disrespectful to Trump. He was being faithful to his oath, to his duty, to everything his uniform represented. In a way, his refusal to compromise that duty was actually the highest form of respect he could show. Not just to the Queen, but to the very concept of military service. Trump stood there for a moment, processing this. The guard's words had been spoken so calmly, so matter-of-factly that they were impossible to take as an insult. They were simply true. The guard did serve the Queen. That was his job, his purpose, his entire reason for standing in that spot wearing that uniform. The Americans in the group seemed to understand this, at least intellectually. The United States military operates differently. American soldiers swear an oath to defend the Constitution, not to serve a person, but they could recognize the parallel. The guard was following his oath, his duty, just as American soldiers follow theirs. That kind of commitment transcends national boundaries. The British officials felt a surge of quiet pride. This was their military tradition on display at its finest, not through aggression or confrontation, but through simple, unwavering adherence to duty. The guard had handled an awkward situation with perfect professionalism. He'd neither compromised his standards nor been disrespectful to a foreign dignitary. In the crowd, people were reacting to what they'd just witnessed. Some were smiling, appreciating the guard's calm assertion of his duty. Others were debating what it meant, what implications it had. A few were already typing on their phones, sharing what they'd seen with friends and followers. "Did you hear that?" Someone whispered excitedly. "I serve Her Majesty the Queen," another person repeated, testing the words, feeling their weight. "That's proper British," an older gentleman said approvingly. "That's how it should be done." The guard himself showed no reaction to any of this. He'd said what needed to be said. Now he returned to his primary duty, which was standing his post in silence. His brief verbal intervention hadn't changed his physical stance at all. He remained exactly where he was, exactly how he should be, a perfect example of military discipline. The protocol officer seemed almost relieved. The guard's statement had actually made his job easier. It had clarified the situation in a way that his longer explanation perhaps hadn't quite managed. Sometimes brevity is more powerful than elaboration. Sometimes a simple truth stated plainly carries more weight than any amount of diplomatic language. Trump began moving away now, the moment definitively over. The group fell back into formation, continuing along the planned route. But something had shifted. The atmosphere was different now. There was a clearer understanding of boundaries, of different traditions, of the lines that exist between different systems and cultures. As they walked away, the guard remained at his post, unchanged and unmoved. He would stand there for the rest of his shift, whether that was minutes or hours more. He would maintain his stance and his silence, doing his duty as he'd been trained to do, as countless guards before him had done, as countless guards after him would do. But those 5 words had already begun their journey into history. "I serve Her Majesty the Queen, sir." They would be repeated in news reports. They would be quoted in articles. They would be discussed in military academies and diplomatic circles. They would become one of those moments that defines something larger than itself. The sun continued to shine on Windsor Castle. The birds continued to sing. Life went on. But everyone who had witnessed that moment knew they'd seen something significant. A quiet assertion of duty. A calm defense of tradition. A reminder that some things, some principles stand firm regardless of who asks them to bend. Part 7. The viral moment. Within minutes of the encounter, the video was online. Someone in the crowd had captured it on their phone and immediately posted it to social media. Then the news networks picked it up from their own footage. Then international outlets grabbed it. Then it spread like wildfire across every platform imaginable. By the time Trump's motorcade left Windsor Castle, the clip had already been viewed hundreds of thousands of times. An hour later, millions. By evening, it was everywhere. You couldn't scroll through any social media feed without seeing it. It was on television news programs around the world. Radio hosts were discussing it. Newspapers were preparing articles about it for their next editions. The video was short, maybe 30 seconds of footage depending on which version you watched. But those 30 seconds captured everything. Trump approaching the guard, the expectant gesture, the guard's complete stillness, the growing awkwardness, the protocol officer's intervention, and finally, most importantly, the guard's calm statement. "I serve Her Majesty the Queen, sir." People watched it over and over. They shared it with friends. They posted it on their own pages with commentary. Everyone seemed to have an opinion about what they'd witnessed. The comment sections filled up with thousands, then tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands of responses. Some people were firmly on the guard's side. "Good for him," they wrote, standing up for his duty and his country. They praised his discipline, his professionalism, his unwavering commitment to protocol. They saw him as a hero, someone who didn't back down even when faced with pressure from one of the most powerful men in the world. "This is what integrity looks like," one popular comment read. "The guard knew his duty and he stuck to it. That's real strength, not the kind of strength that demands respect, but the kind that earns it." Others appreciated the cultural lesson the moment provided. "Americans need to understand that different countries have different protocols," someone wrote. "You can't just expect everyone to follow American customs. That's not how the world works." Of course, there were people who saw it differently. Some felt the guard had been disrespectful. Trump was a head of state, they argued. He deserved basic courtesy. They felt the guard could have made an exception. That rigid adherence to rules sometimes misses the bigger picture of diplomatic relations. "It's just a salute," one comment read. Would it really have hurt to show some respect to a visiting dignitary? Sometimes being technically right isn't the same as doing the right thing. Others took it even further, seeing the moment as symbolic of larger tensions between America and Europe, between different approaches to tradition and authority. These comments often got political quickly, bringing in all sorts of issues that had nothing to do with the actual encounter. But beyond the arguments about who was right and who was wrong, people were fascinated by the human drama of it all. There was something compelling about watching this standoff unfold. Two men, two sets of expectations, two different understanding of how the world should work, all colliding in one brief moment. The British media had a field day with it. Tabloids ran headlines like "Guard puts Trump in his place and royal protection. We serve the Queen." More serious newspapers took a thoughtful approach, discussing the protocols of the Queen's Guard and the challenges of international diplomacy. Opinion pieces debated whether the incident revealed anything meaningful about British-American relations. British citizens seemed largely proud of their Guard. Social media posts from British users often expressed satisfaction that their military traditions had been maintained. "That's our lad," one tweet read, accompanied by the British flag emoji. "Doing his duty properly. That's what we expect from our guards." In America, reactions were more divided. Some Americans appreciated the Guard's dedication to duty, seeing parallels with American military values. "As a veteran, I respect that Guard," one American wrote. "He had his orders and he followed them. That's what good soldiers do." Others felt differently, thinking the Guard should have been more flexible. American culture often values adaptability and making exceptions for practical reasons. The rigid adherence to protocol struck some American viewers as unnecessarily stubborn. The international response added even more layers. People from countries with their own royal traditions generally understood the guard's position immediately. Those from republics sometimes needed more explanation about why the protocols existed. Everyone brought their own cultural context to understanding what they'd watched. News channels ran segments analyzing every aspect of the encounter. Body language experts discussed Trump's gestures and the guard's posture. Diplomatic correspondents explained the protocols and traditions involved. Military analysts talked about the training guards undergo. Everyone had something to say. Some of the most interesting discussions happened in unexpected places. Military forums had long threads discussing the incident, with veterans from various countries sharing their own experiences with protocol and duty. History buffs debated the origins of the Queen's Guard traditions and how they'd evolved over centuries. Educational content started appearing too. YouTube videos explaining the role of the Queen's Guard, their history, their training, and their protocols. These videos got millions of views from people who suddenly wanted to understand more about these soldiers they'd seen in tourist photos but never really thought about. Memes, of course, were inevitable. The internet loves turning serious moments into humor. There were jokes comparing the guard to video game characters who stand perfectly still. Photoshopped images placing the guard in various historical situations. Humorous takes on "I serve Her Majesty the Queen" applied to everything from refusing to do household chores to declining party invitations. But beneath the humor and the debates, something more significant was happening. The incident had sparked genuine conversations about duty, loyalty, tradition, and respect. People were thinking about what it means to commit to something larger than yourself. They were considering how different cultures approach authority and service. Teachers started using the video in classrooms to discuss international relations and cultural differences. It became a teaching moment, an example of how misunderstandings can arise from different expectations and traditions. Students debated who handled the situation better and what they would have done in either position. The video even reached people who normally don't pay attention to news or politics. It had that viral quality that transcends typical audience segments. Young people shared it. Old people shared it. It crossed political lines, national boundaries, and cultural divides. Everyone, it seemed, had seen the video, or at least heard about it. Within days, interview requests were flooding in. Everyone wanted to talk to people who had been there. The protocol officer found himself briefly famous, praised for his diplomatic handling of the situation. Other guards were asked about the protocols and their experiences. Even tourists who had been in the crowd were contacted by media outlets wanting first-hand accounts. The guard himself, true to form, never gave an interview. He returned to his duties and maintained his professional silence. This somehow made him even more compelling to the public. In an age where everyone shares everything, his continued discretion seemed almost revolutionary. The moment had taken on a life of its own, growing far beyond the 30 seconds of actual interaction. It meant different things to different people, sparked different conversations in different communities, and became a reference point for discussions that had nothing to do with the original incident. And through it all, the video kept being watched, shared, discussed, and debated. Millions of views became tens of millions. The guard's words, "I serve Her Majesty the Queen, sir," had become part of the cultural conversation, a phrase people recognized and referenced, a moment that somehow captured something important about duty, tradition, and the courage to stand firm in your principles. Part 8. The lasting impact. Months passed after that day at Windsor Castle, then years, but the moment never really faded from public memory. It became one of those incidents that people reference, that gets brought up in conversations, that serves as shorthand for larger ideas about duty and tradition. The guard's 5 words had earned their place in the cultural vocabulary. The incident fundamentally highlighted something important about how different nations approach ceremony and protocol. America, for all its military might and deep respect for armed forces, has always maintained a certain informality in its democratic traditions. Presidents are called Mr. President, not Your Majesty. Military protocols are important but flexible. The emphasis is on practical results more than rigid adherence to ancient customs. Britain, on the other hand, has spent centuries perfecting its ceremonies. The monarchy might be largely symbolic, but that symbolism matters. The protocols aren't just rules, they're living connections to history. When a guard stands his post according to regulations written generations ago, he's not being old-fashioned. He's maintaining continuity with the past, honoring everyone who wore that uniform before him. The encounter at Windsor Castle became a perfect illustration of this difference. Trump, coming from an American context, saw a soldier and expected military courtesy. That's not unreasonable from his perspective. In his experience as commander-in-chief, soldiers saluted him. It was automatic, expected, part of how things worked. So why wouldn't this soldier do the same? But the guard served a different system with different rules. His duty was to the crown, specifically and exclusively. The protocols that governed his behavior weren't suggestions he could adjust for convenience. They were absolute requirements that defined his role. To break them, even for a visiting dignitary, would have been a betrayal of everything his position represented. For those who studied the incident carefully, there were lessons about respect that went beyond the surface level. Trump had demanded respect, expecting it to be given automatically based on his status and position. But the guard taught a different lesson. Real respect isn't demanded. It's earned through understanding and honoring the customs of others. If Trump had asked beforehand about the protocols, if he'd shown interest in understanding British military traditions, he would have learned that guards don't salute foreign dignitaries. He could have taken photos with guards in appropriate contexts. He could have expressed appreciation for their service in ways consistent with their regulations. That would have shown genuine respect. Instead, the encounter became a moment where expectation crashed into reality, and in that crash, something valuable was revealed. The guard's commitment to duty, his willingness to maintain standards even in an uncomfortable situation, demonstrated a kind of integrity that many people found inspiring. The guard himself returned to his regular duties and never sought attention for what happened. In interviews that other guards gave afterward, they consistently emphasized that he hadn't done anything unusual or heroic. He'd simply followed the protocols he was trained to follow. Any guard in his position would have done the same thing. That, they said, was the whole point, but the public saw it differently. To people watching, the guard had become a symbol. He represented the idea that some things matter more than momentary comfort or avoiding awkwardness. That duty and principle can't be compromised just because someone important asks. That true strength sometimes means standing still and saying no. His reputation wasn't just maintained through this incident, it was enhanced. People respected him more, not less, for refusing to bend the rules. This itself was an important lesson in a world where flexibility is often praised above consistency. Sometimes standing firm is exactly the right thing to do. The British military used the incident in training, though not in the way you might expect. They didn't use it to teach guards how to handle difficult situations. That training already existed. Instead, they used it as an example of how proper adherence to protocol protects both the individual soldier and the institution. The guard wasn't in trouble because he'd followed the rules. If he had saluted Trump, breaking protocol, that's when there would have been problems. Trump continued with his political career, and the incident became one of many memorable moments from his public life. Whether it affected his view of British protocols or military traditions is hard to say. He never spoke extensively about it in public. Like many such incidents, it probably seemed more significant to observers than to the actual participants. But for observers, especially for those interested in leadership and duty, the encounter provided lasting food for thought. Leadership programs at military academies started using it as a case study. What should leaders do when their expectations conflict with established rules? How do you maintain authority while respecting others' authority? When is flexibility appropriate and when is firmness necessary? Diplomatic training programs found value in it too. The protocol officer's intervention became a textbook example of how to defuse awkward situations without embarrassing anyone. His calm explanation, his reframing of the guard's refusal as honor rather than disrespect, his smooth transition to moving things forward, all of it demonstrated diplomatic skill at a high level. The incident also became a touchstone in discussions about cultural intelligence. In an increasingly connected world, understanding that different cultures have different norms isn't optional, it's essential. Business leaders, diplomats, military officers, anyone who works across cultural boundaries needs to approach other systems with humility and curiosity, not with assumptions that their own norms are universal. Years later, tourists visiting Windsor Castle still ask about that day. Guards occasionally get questions about saluting protocols. Tour guides include the story in their talks, using it to explain the role and responsibilities of the Queen's Guard. It's become part of the castle's living history, another layer added to centuries of stories. The video still gets shared periodically, whenever discussions turn to topics like duty, respect, or cross-cultural misunderstandings. New generations discover it and have their own debates about who was right and what it all means. The conversation continues, evolving with each new group that watches those 30 seconds of footage. What makes the moment so enduring is its universality. Everyone has experienced times when their expectations didn't match reality. Everyone has faced situations where they had to choose between going along to get along or standing firm on principle. Everyone understands at some level the tension between different systems and different ways of seeing the world. The guard's words, "I serve Her Majesty the Queen, sir," resonated because they were so clear and simple. In a complex world full of ambiguity and compromise, there was something powerful about such a straightforward statement of purpose. He wasn't serving convenience. He wasn't serving his own interests. He wasn't even serving the immediate diplomatic situation. He was serving his queen, his country, his oath, and his duty. And in serving those things faithfully, even when it was uncomfortable, even when it might have been easier to make an exception, he taught everyone watching a lesson about integrity, not the loud, aggressive kind of integrity that makes demands and insists on being right, but the quiet kind of integrity that simply does what should be done, regardless of who's watching or what pressures exist to do otherwise. The lasting impact of that moment wasn't really about Trump or the Guard as individuals. It was about the principles they represented in that brief encounter, the collision of different expectations, the importance of understanding before judging, the value of protocols and traditions that connect us to something larger than ourselves, the courage required to stand firm when it would be easier to compromise. These lessons transcend the specific incident. They apply to countless situations in work, in relationships, and civic life. When do we compromise and when do we stand firm? How do we respect others while maintaining our own principles? What does it really mean to serve something greater than ourselves? The Guard couldn't answer those questions for anyone else. He could only answer them for himself, in that moment at his post. And his answer was clear. He served the Queen. Everything else followed from that. The protocols existed for good reasons. Duty meant something. Some things don't bend even for presidents and protocol and the pressure of the moment. And somehow, in standing still and speaking 5 simple words, he gave the world something to think about that lasted far longer than anyone expected, not because he was trying to make a point or create a viral moment, but because he was simply doing his duty, the way countless guards before him had done it, the way countless guards after him would continue to do it. That's the real story. Not about confrontation or conflict, but about commitment, about what it means to serve something faithfully, about the quiet dignity of doing your job well, even when no one would blame you for taking the easy way out, about standing your post, keeping your standards, and trusting that the rules exist for reasons that matter. The ancient walls of Windsor Castle had witnessed it all, and they would witness much more in the centuries to come. But for everyone who was there that day,